Hi, as Tim mentioned, I'm Eric Ries, and I write the blog Startup Lessons Learned. I'm actually deeply honored to be here in a really new environment for me to share a little bit of what is happening in Silicon Valley. The last 10 years of my life I've spent as a professional entrepreneur, most of that in Silicon Valley. And I've spent the last year really on an inquiry into what is it that makes startups succeed and what makes them fail, and then, of course, what can we do about it. So as an introduction to entrepreneurship, let me start with the number one most important thing you need to know about startups, and that is that most startups fail, and I brought a demonstration. Since we're talking today about Government 2.0, I thought it'd be good to take a quick look back at a recent wave of innovation. This is Web 2.0. A graphic designer put together this quilt kind of at the height of the Web 2.0 revolution, and here's our midterm report card. So it hasn't been a great run, but this is actually relatively typical of high-tech startups. But what bothers me is not that we have startups that fail, because after all, this is a risky venture. What bothers me is that a lot of these companies have failed for a really bad reason, which I'll get to in a moment. But first, what is a startup? Because when we think of the word startup, I think for most people this conjures up a very specific image. It's kind of like two guys in a garage. They were working on some fancy new gizmotron that when they finally perfect the technology, they're going to be rich and famous, but in the meantime, they're stuck eating ramen noodles. And then all of a sudden, the gizmotron works, and now they're vindicated, and their idea has gone from ridiculous to obvious. But that's actually not what entrepreneurship looks like, the way it's lived every day. And what's really exciting about the trends that we've been talking today, about the changes in the platform for entrepreneurship, is that it's allowing entrepreneurship to really be understood at a much deeper level. So here's my definition that I wanted to share with you today. A startup is a human institution designed to create something new under conditions of extreme uncertainty. So what that means is that you find startups and entrepreneurs in all kinds of contexts where you wouldn't necessarily expect them. Because, of course, it doesn't matter what kind of noodles you eat. What matters is the context in which you operate. So, in other words, a startup is an experiment, an inquiry into how the world might look under the vision of the startup's founders. And the question we have to ask ourselves is, what makes an experiment a success or a failure? The Web 2.0 and many, many high-tech startups, this is what really gets to me. They fail not because the technology doesn't work, but because nobody wants the technology when it's finally ready. And that basic, simple fact, which I think a lot of us view as inevitable, I think we can do something about. But it requires a change in the way we manage these high-risk experiments we call startups. And that's the problem with the two guys in a garage image, because it doesn't really conjure up management as a key discipline, but it's actually very important. If you look at successful startups and you compare them to unsuccessful startups, and you ask what's different, it's not really the quality of the founder's initial ideas. And I say this as a former founder myself. Most startup founders have horrendously bad ideas when they start out. What makes the successful companies successful is this concept we call the pivot, the ability to change direction in response to a failure so that the failure of your initial idea doesn't mean the failure of your company. And what's interesting about that is that it turns out that within every bad idea is kind of a kernel of truth, a little inkling of a really good idea kind of waiting to be born if we chip away the marble of the bad ideas of the founders that surround it. And so the pivot is a systematic way that we keep one foot firmly rooted in what we've learned about what does and does not work, while changing the other foot into something new, an incremental and kind of zigzaggy path to what we call product market fit for startups. And the premise of the lean startup is actually relatively simple. If we can do those pivots faster, then we're more likely to find success before we run out of money. And lean startups go faster. That's fundamentally what they do. There's three reasons for that. The first, I think we've talked a lot about today, which is the changes in the underlying technology platform. The second is a new thing called customer development, a discipline for finding out what customers want before you build it, aka before it is too late. And of course, the trend that we sometimes call agile or lean product development. We've talked so much about platforms. In fact, hearing today about government as a platform, we sometimes, I think, forget that before there was government as a platform, there was the platform as a platform. The actual technology has changed a lot, and that's very important. We just heard that's changing the access to entrepreneurship, which I think is very exciting. It's also changing the cost of entrepreneurship, but I think the really important impact is its impact on the speed at which you can build and test new products and new product prototypes. That speed has really changed even in the last 5 years, to the point where I think it is now the most exciting time in history ever to be an entrepreneur. But to understand that change, it's not just about the technology, and I think that's been a bit of a theme in the conference, which I'm excited to hear. This is really about management, the management of the people who build technology. And so just for some historical context, here's a diagram of what product development used to look like. When I was brought up as an engineer, this is the model I was taught for how projects should be built, the waterfall methodology, where progress proceeds according to a plan that's relatively linear. And the academic research on IT projects built this way is really bad. I think something like 6 out of 10 projects fail outright. That means the lucky ones are the ones that come in way late and way over budget. So for high-tech product development, this isn't a very good approach, but it's important to understand that it does have its place. It works really well in a context where both the problem and the solution are relatively well understood. It's just that when we're talking about high-tech, and certainly when we're talking about startups, we don't live in that world. So this is a phenomenon called agile product development, which I hope is relatively well known even here, which says that if we're going to build products, even if we know what problem we're trying to solve, let's build the product itself in an iterative fashion so that we get progress for how we're doing along the way. And actually, agile is tremendously effective in big IT organizations, where we really understand the problem we're trying to solve, we're just not quite sure how to get there. But as I said at the top, those conditions of extreme uncertainty that startups face mean this doesn't actually work for them either. This is what the world looks like from the point of view of a lean startup. We have two concurrent and iterative processes trying to answer two really difficult questions. First of all, what problem are we trying to solve? Who's the customer? And who's going to use this technology when we finally build it? And of course, given our current hypothesis about that, how can we find the best path to build it? And this has really important implications for the organization of these startups so that they become what we call built to learn, where validated learning about what customers want really is the unit of progress for everything the company does. Or to simplify a little bit, this is the fundamental feedback loop that powers all startups. We translate ideas into products, we test those products against reality, see what happens, and then learn for our next set of ideas. And for my military colleagues in the audience, this is a version of the OODA loop pioneered by a fighter pilot named John Boyd. But in the context of startups, what matters is that every practice, every technology, every action we take serves to minimize our total time through this feedback loop and not just optimize one of the individual departments or tasks that make it up. In other words, faster startups means we get to do more experiments per dollar. And whether you're in venture capital or in a big enterprise, or I've heard in government, it matters how much you learn for every dollar spent. So lean startups is not really about cheap. It's about speed, it's about learning, and it's about getting a lot more value out of the precious dollars, and more importantly, the precious human capital we pour into entrepreneurship. Since it's Government 2.0, I thought I'd ask you a question, maybe to discuss during the break. The question is, if you could do the kinds of experiments I'm talking about, what would you want to do? And how does your perspective change if you think about doing those experiments not one at a time, but by the dozen or maybe even by the hundreds? For the implementers in the room, there's an awful lot more to the practice of the lean startup than just these kind of broad theoretical ideas, and this information is available online. So thank you all very, very much. This is really an honor to be here. My contact information is here. Look forward to continuing the conversation. Thank you all very much.